Good morning. We'll give this a second for some people to join. I see Michael. Morning, Michael. KG. Hey, KG. Good morning. All right. So yeah, good morning. It's Friday. We'll jump into this pretty quick just because I don't want to keep us too long. And as a reminder, we've kind of been taking a walk with the Gospel of Mark and specifically looking at it with the help of um, this book, Render Unto God, um, by James Newton Poling, and in particular looking at the lens that he is using, which he is drawing heavily off of Ched Myers, and mostly from a book of Ched Myers is called Binding the Strong Man. So using it as a lens that can help us to engage the text a little bit. And we've covered like basics around context for the writing of the gospel and for that community. Um, you know, early first century, roughly a little bit before 70 CE. Jesus born into poor community, has died like 35 years earlier. Mark is then writing after the fact for kind of a parallel community, one that's economically oppressed, farming community in Galilee, responsible for having to provide a lot of agricultural supply to Jerusalem and to the Roman installed government that's there. Last week we talked about some of the economic systems that were in place, including reciprocity systems. That is like sharing resources within the family, sharing resources with a balance of back and forth with the wider family and between tribes. We talked about systems of the redistribution system centered in the temple, where you add a debt to yourself, put a little bit into the temple for some like future security if something should arise, and we talked about the Roman tribute system, where Rome is going to kind of take what they need, whether that's agricultural product, labor through slave labor, or wages or whatever they need. Like Rome's just going to take it. And then we also talked about the kind of the purity system, in that if for some reason you're sick or you get unclean, you've been touching on blood or animal product or manure, or even like monthly menstruation cycles, you're considered unclean and impure, and you have to then pay in to do ritual cleansings with the temple. So for Mark's community, that we talked a little bit about how that becomes a problem. Um, Major obstacles in rigorous conformity to the demands of the purity systems for ordinary people are economic. So their daily circumstances, their work, their lives, their trade, especially for the peasantry, which is Mark's community and kind of the parallel to Jesus' community. You're just continually exposed to contagion, and it was near impossible with all of the different uh, forces and demands um, upon your own means. The outlay of time, the outlay of money or goods involved in the cleansing rituals, um, just couldn't afford it. And so you have this perpetual um, economic vulnerability of this peasantry kind of group of farmers that Mark is sympathetic to that community, and he finds his learnings from. Jesus match up with that? So, and in particular, thinking about the healing narratives of Jesus. Every time that Jesus is healing somebody in the Gospel of Mark, he's literally bypassing the entire purity system, and objecting to a debt system that contributed to the poverty of the poor. Now, when Jesus does that, he's ticking people off because you're messing with my money. So that's what Jesus is out there doing in the Gospel of Mark, is messing with specifically the money related to the temple, the priests, the Sadducees, um, and for that matter, Rome to a lesser extent. Today, we're going to just talk about some of the major players that are present in this time, um, and look at some of their responses. For within the kind of the wider Israelite community, the wider Jewish community, there's different groups, and they can see these systems at play. Roman occupation, problematic or not. They can see purity and debt system, problematic or not. They can see that, and each kind of group has a response to it, not necessarily to overthrow it every time, but each of them has some type of response to um, occupation, to oppression. And so it's let's talk about Rome first. For Rome, and let's jump back to like Jesus' time. Rome for Jesus' time, you can think about the installed Roman governors and regional rulers. And so for Jesus, that's going to be Herod and it's going to be Pilate. We're pretty familiar with that from the stories. And I do want to note, um, if the if the Bible is your primary window to looking at first century life, just keep in mind that it's limited in scope. The Bible is talking about some really, especially the New Testament, is talking about some really specific communities. We're not looking at like necessarily what's happening all around outside of those communities. So just keep this in mind. But anyway, so for Jesus, the installed leadership, Pilate and Herod, and including like Caiaphas, the chief priest at the time, right? So these are kind of the installed Jewish elite, installed Roman military types who are collaborating with Rome. Um, so Poling and Mayers kind of describe what happens because of those installed leadership, both at the time of Jesus and for the time of Mark's community. Um, Various revolts might pop up from time to time. Um, Polling points to slave rebellions in Rome that we can read about. So uh, this is like Spartacus, like gladiators and slaves banding together and then fighting it out with Roman military government. So think that's happening all over kind of the Roman Empire. So there are some little revolts that happen in the Jerusalem type region. And when Mark's community comes along, there is actually a brief successful revolt in the sense that it managed to take control of the temple in Jerusalem, which is like the center of economic and political power. It takes control of the temple. It actually destroys the temple. Um, and Polling and Mayers are kind of saying revolt was inevitable, that these things would pop up due to the consistent poor economic um, and political performance of the Roman colonial administration, so those installed players, and the endemic corruption that went along with that. So think like chief priests in the temple who were receiving money through the purity system and through the debt system, and then not necessarily distributing it back out appropriately, or kind of lining their own pockets, like endemic corruption present in those places. Equivocation and exploitation from collaborating Jewish elite, those are those priests and Sadducees, um, and the diverse currents of resurgent Jewish nationalism and peasant disillusionment. So That's where we're at. Those things are combining, and just like you can only like basically you can only push people around for so long before they're going to say something about it. Any colonial or any neo-colonial occupation requires some participation from the native groups. For Rome in Jerusalem, it was the Jewish elite, the temple priests, those types of groups, and then those persons who were installed and supported by the Romans. So we have that at play. Let's talk about who some of these groups are. Once the temple is kind of taken over and then destroyed, what are your options? Your options are to try and hold it, um, and you could probably assume that, okay, we just kicked Rome out for a minute. They're definitely going to come back, and they're going to come back with a whole host of military force. And with that knowledge, there are disagreements from the different Jewish groups about like how do we do this? Like how are we going to either hold on to this or reform some of the pieces that we know are problematic? Well, so the Sadducees and the priests, they are generally in control, and they're some of that collaborating group with Rome. They control the temple. They benefit the most from the purity and the debt system that saw the sacrifice and fees that came in to support them at the temple. So they're doing fine with or without the Roman occupation, so long as people are going into the temple with their funds. They are conservative in the sense that they're conserving the system that was at play, and um, and it kind of grew out of the sense that, or one way to look at it is growing out of a sense that if we as a Jewish people are going to survive Roman occupation long term, then collaborating with them on some level is our best bet for survival of this period of history. So you can try and get a little bit of like, what's the reason? Why would you participate in this? And one way to look at it is just simply survival. Um, the Pharisees. When we talk about the Pharisees, still think Jewish religious leaders, but they're not centered in the temple. They're a little more out and about and into the highways and the byways. Um, the Pharisees wanted to decentralize the purity and debt system, expanding it out into those rural areas, which would make them a more essential part of the religious practice. It also would decentralize where the money is going. So instead of it all going into Jerusalem and then hopefully coming back, it's going into whatever locality and then hopefully getting distributed in that way. It's not necessarily an overthrow or doing away with the tribute and purity system. It's just moving it into a different area. Another major group at play is the Essenes. And the Essenes are kind of pushing for a withdrawal from the social mainstream in order to preserve religious observance. So this is more if I'm no, I'm not going to call it quarantine. If I'm out and about less, I'm less likely to encounter things things that are going to put me out of a state of kind of purity, which allows me to be able to fully participate in society. And so it was more of like a let's get out and stay away from each other. God, that's hilarious. Anyway, I won't call it. We'll stay away from that. Okay. All right. Now, zealot. The zealots are kind of representing your military options, your military overthrow of Rome. They are critical both of the Roman occupation and the Jewish collaborators, but they still maintained that temple redistribution system could work fairly, and the sense there is it could work fairly if we were in charge. So it was kind of this, you're still not doing away with the system. You're just saying like, wow, it'd be fine if we were in control of it. And the zealots kind of path for that would have been militarily. Um, For mayor and for polling, they always say that there's different approaches to dealing with oppression, and we just heard a little bit of it based on the different groups, but in general, they're saying there's kind of four ways that you could be uh, leaning into or resisting against um, oppression. There's collaboration, there's renewal, there's revolt, and then the fourth option that they say is kind of Mark's option is non-alignment. So we'll jump back quickly to collaboration. The elite classes of leaders, and the only way that you're really becoming elite in this sense is that you're being propped up by Rome and by the where the flow of money is. And so the elite classes of leaders, mostly in Jerusalem, only cooperation with Rome could enable us to survive this period. And they trade their political and economic allegiance in exchange for that limited local autonomy for continued religious practice. Main problem being the masses will revolt because you're both seen as like part of their group, but also not caring for them. And so people are going to revolt when those sorts of things happen. Renewal was the approach of the Pharisees and the Essenes, where they're both renewal movements, and they represented competition for Jerusalem. So they represented competition for the collaborators or the priests. But they maintained that the distribution system could work fairly, either at the temple or spread back out into the more rural areas. And then there's the revolt, so that's the Zealots, and representing a military overthrow of Rome, which ultimately, again, there's that brief success period of overthrowing the temple, but you got to know that Rome's coming back, and you're not going to be able to stand against them. And so that's why Polling and Mayer say that Mark, based on the teachings that he's getting from this Nazarene prophet and Jesus, Mark is saying these things aren't going to work. And Mark's argument, they say, ends up being subversive and constructive. And it says that the means, that is military means, and the ends, that is just reforming the system, the things that the Zealots, the Pharisees, and the Essenes and the priests are pushing, they're fundamentally counter-revolutionary, and wrong. They don't agree, and some of that might be self-preservation for Mark, in that they know, as peasants, they are left defenseless out in Galilee, and when Rome comes back, they're not going to have any protection. They're just going to be wiped out. So like the Zealot cause isn't really an option, and they were abandoned by some of their Zealot leaders. Like John goes to Jerusalem to join the struggle there, leaving them without leadership in Galilee. Josephus, who was a military commander, defects to Rome as part of the like Roman counterinsurgency program. And so again, you're left without your leadership. And so like the peasants are just exposed out there in Galilee at this time and just kind of waiting for the hammer to drop from Rome. And so Mark, either from self-preservation, or I think, and Myers and Poling are saying, because of the teachings that Mark is picking up from Jesus, he's saying, no, a nonviolent and non-alignment path of resistance is what we're going to have to take. Otherwise, we're all dead. So, so that's how they kind of line Jesus up into this, and that's a little bit. I realize I'm giving you a cliffhanger, but that's what this is. So next week we can talk about like, oh, okay, well, what does non-alignment look like? What does the Jesus story and Mark look like, and how is it that the Mark story is saying resist in this way, critique in this way? We'll look at that next week, and if there's time, we'll talk about like what's the kind of Mark/Jesus economic vision. So that's what we can do next week. But suffice it for today to say those are your major players, and those are that's the debate between like how do we respond, how do we hold resistance, how do we collaborate. All of those things were present and within the different factions of the Jewish community at that time. Deep breath. That was a lot. All right. So thanks for coming on. Thanks for watching. We'll come back next week. We're praying for y'all. We'll see you on Sunday. Please take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Masks. Fill out the census for God's sakes if you still haven't done that. Be kind and be good to one another. We will see you later. Bye bye for now.